Hi everyone, welcome to the AIM webinar series. I'm Mike Ellen, the Member Engagement Manager for AIM, and today I will be moderating the product traceability across the verticals panel discussion. I will be introducing the other panelists of today's session here momentarily, but first I have a few housekeeping items to go over. First is AIM's antitrust policy. It's the policy of AIM Inc. to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activity shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. Next is our collaboration and work product policy. AIM committee meetings or webinars like today's are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM's developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Now today I am here with three experts, and I will be starting off by introducing Susan Flake here from Avery Dennison, who's also the chair for our 2021 Track and Trace Industry Group. Susan?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Susan Flake, Global Director of Business Development for Avery Dennison's Food and Logistics Division. With over 30 years of experience in retail, the last 16 of which have focused on really expanding item level RFID initiatives in both retail and hospitality to help drive next generation solutions. My focus is on inventory visibility for traceability, transparency, labor efficiencies, and food waste reduction. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Susan. Don, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Michael. My name is Don Durm. I'm a 26-year veteran of PLM Fleet as the Vice President of Customer Solutions. PLM Fleet may be a little different for a webinar like this, but PLM manages north of 15,000 refrigerated transport assets in the US, and we are in the cold supply chain, both with food and pharma verticals. With our cold chain expertise, we've offered a number of innovative solutions of track and trace, really starting basically with the digitization of the refrigerated trailer loads and then managing those in real-time movements to include temperature monitoring with our TrustLink product. We now have taken those same principles and moved them into the product level with the PLM TrustLink product line. That is a cloud-based IoT platform consisting of a comprehensive condition monitoring, track and trace solutions that digitizes products in the supply chain, grounded in the principles of mark, digitize, and then utilize throughout the supply chain. As for myself, I am known in the cold chain on food safety regulatory compliance, application and design, and use of technology in supply chain, and consulted with a number of both businesses and governments in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Recently, I testified before the Joint House Senate Agriculture Committee on the use of technology for resilient food supply chain based on the pandemic that we all recently have been going through. And so I'm very looking forward to this webinar, Michael. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Don. And last but not least, Sprague Ackley.
Hi, my name is Sprague Ackley. I work for Digimarc, and I'm in the technology side of things. At Digimarc, I'm a R&D engineer and have had a long career in everything there is to do with printing and scanning of barcodes. Digimarc has a very unique barcode that is both can be spatially spread over an entire item, and also with its massive mathematical redundancy, it's extremely resistant to damage. But we also support all the regular barcodes, and we also support existing cloud-based type platforms, and also our own. We have a couple of platforms ourselves. Outside the company, I work extensively in the standards area, including the AIM groups, most famously the AIM TSC that I've supported for a long time, and also the ISO and GS1 committees. Thanks, Mike.
Great, thank you, Sprague. So let's just get into it. We'll start off discussing the pandemic and how it's exposed vulnerabilities of supply chains. Don, we'll start with you. Can you expand on what happened and how this could be avoided in the future with the use of AIDC technologies?
A really great question, Michael. So, we have to go back to the length of and the complexity of our networks of contemporary supply chains really makes them difficult to regulate and to manage. Is really compounded by a linear, disconnected food supply chain, one up, one back. And where that data resides is really in individual systems and really is not shared along supply chain ecosystems. So visibility really here is the key to building a resilient cold chain. I will be speaking mostly on food because that's where I dwell most of my time at. So these challenges with the recent food supply disruptions presented by the pandemic weren't due to shortages of food in the US. Rather, it was disruptions were really largely caused by consumers shifting their pattern of where they were buying and purchasing their food at. So in this country, we consume food, we get food either two ways, really from grocery or what we'll call retail, or we get it from food service, which are restaurants. These are the two main channels which consumers can access that food today. Both channels have very different requirements to size and packaging, preparation, and then they have two distinct distribution supply chain channels that they go through. Prior to the pandemic, the NRA, which is not the National Rifle Association, National Restaurant Association, reported in January of 2020 that 51% of the US consumer dollar spend was in restaurants all of 2019. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the US experienced what seemed like shortages in the grocery store. And many of us went out there and we saw, no beef in the grocery refrigerators. And so we thought, okay, we're losing this. So, but really what had happened was there was that shifting consumer buying pattern, and then that surge buying what was happening because during pandemics, people experience, a shortage of toilet paper, and we all experienced that one at some point. So the government in the beginning classified PLM actually as essential because we were in the cold chain or the food companies. So just as an example, on the refrigerated trailer side of our business, we actually got a call for 300 refrigerated trailers to store beef that was already being harvested, that was meant for cold storage warehouses, but they were all filled up. So why were they all filled up? And I'm sure that we're thinking about, I have empty shelves at the grocery store, but you're storing all this protein in these refrigerated trailers. So in a matter of a couple of days or a week or so, the US consumer really shifted their buying patterns. So 50% at the restaurant to 50% at the grocery store. Now we're consuming all that food from the grocery store. And so just imagine the flex that has to happen with these two different channels. And these channels necessarily do not overlap. So retail and restaurant don't necessarily two distinct separate channels. So that channel or that shifting of consumer behaviors caused our supply chain to really bend, not necessarily break, but really bend. And so we talk about, specifically in packaging. So at a restaurant, you would get maybe 10 pounds of French fries, frozen French fries. And in a retail situation, a grocery store, they're typically set up for maybe 2 pounds or 5 pounds in the grocery store. So these packages are actually different, and one doesn't shift over to the other. So no one's going to take a 20-pound bag of French fries at a grocery store in itself. So even today, some of the cold storages still have some of this product in their warehouses that they haven't really been able to move out of there. So existing supply chain business practices of one up, one back creates blind spots on visibility on how much and where food is actually at in the supply chain. So in the future, this ability to redirect food to understand where it's at will be imperative to mitigate the impacts of the shocks of these type of supply chain requests. So these gaps in supply chain create another challenge in that is surge buying. Americans panicked. It was important for the US consumers to be assured by their supply chain. We're even hearing today that you better buy your Christmas gifts today because they may not be available to you here shortly because everybody's going to buy. That puts a lot of pressure on supply chain to create these bubbles. So really the better end-to-end supply chain visibility will help stakeholders, governments, and also consumers with the confidence in supply chain. So digitization is going to be important here, Michael.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah. So in that resiliency in supply chain. So we touched on so we're just touching on that digitization. So I'll flip it back over to you, Michael.
Yep. Thank you. Sprague, is there anything you'd want to add to that question?
Well, without question, there was the shift in supply chain. There was also the panic. What the key to the success of that, being corrected was the use of automatic identification. I mean, can you imagine where we would have been without extensive use of existing automatic identification? And it just goes to show how much power that technology has. And if, especially in cold chain, if there was a even deeper involvement down to the serialization level, we would have been able to come out of those problems a lot sooner.
Great. And Susan, do you have anything to add?
I think it really goes and begs one to ask why digitize now and why take action now, and to expand upon that a bit and to emphasize what Sprague and Don have mentioned. Before the pandemic, there were quite a few efforts by innovative leaders in this space to understand if and how technology could affordably solve some of the biggest challenges around efficiencies, around labor optimization and traceability and waste and consumer trust. And frankly, in 2020, that landscape dramatically shifted for all of us. Some of the panic buying and the supply chain shortages have dissipated, some haven't. But many of the learnings from the disruption of COVID-19 have emphasized the need to address whatever that new net normal will be head on. And at the heart of supply chains who are running on thin margins is the ability to predict and forecast demand and consumption across a very complex system of perishable and wide assortment of non-perishable goods. Up until 2020, past performance was always a solid indicator of what to produce and how to distribute it. Let's take, for example, food sales. They were quite stable, growing 3 to 4% annually with a split between grocery and food service. Then what happened? In March of last year, shutdowns caused grocery sales to surge 29%, while food service subsequently dropped 27%. We saw a seesaw effect. The supply chain took weeks to adapt, with distributors stuck in the middle. Combined with pantry loading on staples and labor shortages for fresh food processing, we watched milk poured down the drains. We watched fresh meat and thousands of eggs wasted, all while going to the store to find empty shelves. So, how do we make that balance? According to McKinsey, so recovery of this supply chain will depend on how well the virus is contained, not only here in the States, but globally and at any level of recurrences. But it could take between 1 and 4 years for food service, however, to recover. It is possible that demand will never return in a way similar to pre-pandemic levels. And I think we see that with all the estimates that have been shared around online grocery shopping, creating further challenges across our value chain. So it's clear and evident that supply chains must become more resilient and efficient to offset this risk and uncertainty. And we've all heard it before. The only thing that never changes is change itself. There are more unknowns now than ever, not just in food or in the US, but across every industry on a global scale. Many companies have been struggling for months to get products to consumers as they face shortages in everything from raw materials to labor to cargo containers, among other problems. We take a look at the Port of LA and Long Beach. They have 72 ships out there, each containing thousands of cargo containers, and each one of those cargo containers requiring 8,000 trucks to offload, and it just keeps stockpiling. So some of the questions, some of us are questioning whether it makes sense to promote products now that we can't adequately stock, and hence have cut advertising dollars. I think Facebook and Yahoo and some others have mentioned that their advertising sales will be down in Q4. And in the face of an enduring shortage of computer chips, we look at car manufacturers such as Toyota that have slashed global production by 40%. Ford, Chevy, and Dodge all followed suit. Factories around the world are limiting operations despite powerful demand for their wares. Just a short list of consumer goods, and this isn't a short list by any means of the imagination, that have been subject to back orders and delays and shortages include new school clothes, back to school supplies, bikes, pet food, paint, furniture, tech gadgets, children toys, home appliances, lumber, anything that relies on semiconductor chips, and even fast food staples. So with the way the food supply chain works today, there's very little room for error, very tight margins, very little buffer built in for exception processing or unplanned events. While the sense of instability from the pandemic will go away someday, it won't happen overnight. We don't know what the world and the human behavior will look like going forward, but all of this behavior shifts can have consequences on how we look at food supply chains. For instance, if 40% of the office workers shift to permanently working from home, which is a reality and predicted by Gartner, what happens to the food service industry? How will shifts in travel patterns change for food service for hotels, airports, caterings? Will the rise of home cooking, meal kits, and ready to eat and stay at home at 2020 levels remain? Or will there be peaks and valleys associated with the rush to be back in restaurants and social settings? None of these trends are something that the food supply chains can predict. What they can do, however, is take action on how well they're positioned to adapt quickly, and hence the reason for digitalization. Currently, the food industry is among the lowest penetration for digitalization relative to any other sector of global economy. Going paperless for this industry is still a real hurdle, even though organizations such as ReFed estimate better tracking can eliminate more than 3 million tons of food waste. Digitalization is not just a way to avoid risk. Well, certainly not as exciting as drones, micro-fulfillment centers, and maybe not even pickup lockers. Digitizing the food supply chain is a fundamental need for accuracy, a fundamental need for speed in decisioning, and has a fundamental need for better traceability and inventory optimization. And this only touches on the economics of the question. Digitalization of the food supply chain will have a huge impact in the reduction of food waste, the reduction of greenhouse gases, and help companies meet ESG goals that they have all signed up for, focusing on sustainability today and for our future.
Thank you, Susan. Appreciate that. Our next question, I want to bring Sprague in on this. It seems that everyone is talking about track and trace for fresh foods. What is so compelling about this application?
Well, that's a good question, but Susan, kind of hit the nail on the head with that. And Don also, if you don't know individually what you have, then you can't optimize its path through the supply chain. But there's also just a raw, it's terrible to say this, but there's just a raw financial incentive. We've all experienced product recalls in the past in the fresh food chain. And if you don't know where your tainted lettuce came from, you have to recall like all the lettuce shipped to the entire West Coast, which is a massive logistical problem. It is extremely costly. Estimates like the typical recall will cost a company $10 million. And that's just, one. And so by adding the serialization layer, which can be, a regular barcode added to an item, that adds an incremental cost. The technology that we work with, where you can add the barcode kind of covertly in the background, so you keep the same size label, the same look and feel, but invisible to the people, or nearly invisible, is a barcode that can be scanned when the item is first packed, and at each step along the supply chain, right to the consumer, and then the consumer can scan it themselves. And each of these steps not only allows tracking and efficiency in the cold chain, and first in, first out in the supermarket, and best recipes to use, at the consumer end. But if it's discovered there's a biological outbreak, you can then trace that back to, say, Friday afternoon in a farm in Southern California. And then that Friday afternoon, by the time they caught it, it was Saturday. And they now know a sequence of, maybe 5 or 10,000 serial numbers that were packaged during that time. And that's all you need to recall. And GS1 is working on a great system in enabling 2D scanning at the point of sale, so that literally you scan something at the point of sale and it flags it as one of the recall items. And so it's now, of course, the supermarket can also go in and scan their own items before they go on the shelves. This massively reduces the food waste. Just think of the food waste when you have to throw everything away, and the expense. It's sickening. But having the serialization, especially in fresh foods, not just optimizes the food chain, and of course the health of the consumer, but it saves you a phenomenal amount of money as the owner of the food that goes into the food chain itself. So it's a very, very compelling application. Difficult to keep track of a lot of serial numbers, but both Don and Susan mentioned, there are these cloud-based systems that are out there that are really well developed, excellent, and you can develop your own system, of course, to manage the serial numbers, or go with one of the many excellent platforms that are already out there. And it's just a very, very short payback, basically, and financially an important thing, for any company to think about.
Thank you, Sprague. Don, we have understood that government has increasingly become more active within recent years with the Food Safety Modernization Act in particular. Why should industry be concerned? What part will technology play in this new era of smarter food safety?
Yeah, Michael, really great question. And this is what food companies are actually paying attention to now. And if they're not, they really should be. So FDA during the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, really transformed itself. And it's taken a while for it to get seated. And so what I'm really talking about is they were a regulatory body. They found a problem in the supply chain, and their job was to get it out through a recall system. FSMA converted them into a law enforcement body at that time. So the Department of Justice, when the FSMA was being passed, announced a partnership with FDA adoption, a policy of initiating criminal investigations against any company or its employees that sells a product that causes human illness. So this is a big shift. We're moving from, fining people to holding people accountable criminally. Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney Benjamin C. Miser, this is a quote from him, and I quote, "FDA and DOJ view any human illness caused by a food product as a potential violation of law." Unquote there. So what are some of the examples that we've seen recently that FDA has utilized some of this law enforcement power? So a distributor was fined $19.4 million for some unsafe food practices. It's not really important who it is. It's just they were fined that $19.4 million. And this was really during the enactment of FSMA. So FSMA took us several years to come online. But a recent QSR was fined a record $25 million over tainted food. If you look a little deeper behind that, you'll find there's also a 3-year deferred prosecution. So they've identified individuals to be held accountable for that. Currently, there's an ice cream company back in 2015 that had some challenges and with food safety, and they're now being prosecuted today. The president is actually under prosecution, and so that's going forward. What is some other evidence? You may not know this, but the Indiana State Police is just one example where FDA has gone in and trained them to utilize temperature guns to pull over refrigerated trucks and then pulp the temperatures of that vehicle. That was actually on one of the morning shows. I think it was Good Morning America, where they followed the Indiana State Police doing this. So there's a new era of smarter food safety. And these are the 4 pillars that FDA have set out: smarter tools for approaches, new business models, and we're talking about e-commerce there, which Susan was talking about. Food safety culture, Frank Yarnes, Deputy Commissioner, he actually from FDA really wrote a book on food safety culture, and that's what he's known for. But the other founding principle is the tech-enabled traceability. And we're seeing this with the enhanced traceability list. That's the 204 rule, where information that Sprague talked about will have to travel along with that food through the supply chain. And really, that tech-enabled supply chain, Frank actually at a recent conference said that he wanted to monitor food, as an asset individually. He wants temperature compliance. He wants to get rid of, just like Susan talked about, is the paper-based system. That's what he's looking at. So these are the guardrails that are being set up and providing a voice of food in real time. So FDA is throwing in a budgetary request for 2022 of $6.2 billion. So that's why people should be concerned. And technology is a way to be able to tap into that, to be able to look at supply chains, and to be able to respond to this. And consumers, your customers, will ask for more. So I think that's a pretty good summation of really what's happening with government, what we're seeing with FDA.
Great, thanks, Don. And just sticking with you, what are the opportunities for change management in the food supply chain for the adoption of supply chain technology?
Yeah, so change management is always about tough. It's always about pain points. And human nature is really to stay in state, doesn't really want to do anything different. So we've heard all this quoted before, and I say this from the stage quite often. Roughly 1 in 6 Americans, 48 million people, get sick from eating something. 128,000 people are hospitalized. 3,000 people die of foodborne illnesses every year in the United States. So do you think this is enough pain point to affect change in statistics? Not really. And then doing the same thing over and over again is the definition of insanity. So the challenge here for food distributors, and Susan touched on this, is that pushing food down the supply chain is a very slim margin business. It's a 2% business at best when you're pushing that food down. The standard bearer throughout time has been, for the last 50 years, has been that barcode. And that requires direct engagement with a technology to get that data from there. But, we've all seen advancements here recently, autonomous vehicles. We're doing space travel in commercialization space within recent months. And so what really, that we're really looking at is, for food supply chain, is really about impacting the cost, okay, of pushing that food. There's not a lot of money to add expense to it. But, Susan mentioned about food waste, okay? So it's reported by USDA that 30 to 40% of our food is wasted in the supply chain. FDA reports that food recalls actually went up 92% since FSMA was enacted. Sprague mentioned about the average recall is $10 million. So our recalls have actually doubled. The expense of recalls have actually doubled since the FSMA was passed. Pew reports that 55% of consumers will not purchase your product under recall. 15% of consumers won't come back to you again. Bloomberg reports that food fraud, okay, is $40 billion a year. Under that, Oceana did a study and found that a third of our seafood is actually mislabeled. We're paying for not what we're getting. As an example of that is 69% of the wild caught salmon in the US is actually farm raised. So there's where all your costs are at that we could get if we used technology to be able to do this. Americans spend the least amount of money as a percentage of their income on food. Food is cheap. And the recent pandemic really has exposed some of these vulnerabilities in the supply chain of one up, one back. And supply chains have these pain points exposed, making our food and putting IoT devices on them to automatically report and to digitize these projects so you can utilize that information for the supply chain will actually help distributors and food companies to be able to track this and to be able to apply other technologies to help and reduce food waste and all these other problems in the supply chain.
Great, thank you, Don. So Sprague, it seems like when you read about track and trace these days, it always mentions serialization. Are they equivalent? If not, what is a track and trace application that is not serialized?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. You know, in the fresh food area, there's really, you have to serialize. You know, you have a clamshell holding a bunch of strawberries. It doesn't help to have, you know, it identified on the crate level. But there are some applications where you want to track and trace a class of items. And one that is getting a lot of publicity recently is plastics. You know, I don't think there's anyone on this call that hasn't heard about how we have to keep plastics out of the environment, and a tremendous amount of plastic is going into landfill. And you know, and hopefully, at least, you know, here in Oregon, we try to recycle all our plastics. But when you recycle plastic, you have this big vat full of different types of plastic, and they all have to be sorted. And there's a project going on in Europe called the Holy Grail Project, and it's actually in the phase right now where it is being tested in real live application in the entire city of Copenhagen, where every plastic item is marked with a barcode that is molded into the surface of the plastic in a way that is imperceivable to the user. It looks kind of like a slight frosting. And so the way they do that is they etch in the mold this pattern, and then every bottle that comes out of that mold, and whether it's a strawberry soda or a cola flavored soda, it's the plastic itself that is being tracked and traced. So every bottle that comes out of that mold has a unique barcode molded into the plastic. And since it's spread all over the plastic and only requires a tiny little piece to read, you can crush that and make it, you know, drag it through the mud and twist it up, whatever. And then when it gets into the recycle chain, it goes flying down the belt and is read with overhead cameras at high speed, and then is sorted. The little jet of air blows it out to the side. And so you can end up with, instead of a mix of lots of different plastic that you can kind of melt down into, you know, bricks or something, this allows you to sort by individual type of plastic, which generates pure stream. And when you have pure stream material, you can use that very cost effectively to make new material. And so instead of plastic being a drag on the environment and costs a lot of money to get out of the environment, this method of track and tracing allows plastic to become a commodity, a valuable commodity. And so that radically increases the you know, the participation. People love to know that their plastic is being reused, doesn't go into landfill. People making the plastic bottles save money because now they have material that they can use to make new plastic. It's really a very exciting win-win application of track and trace that is not exactly serialization, but is still, in my estimation, a wonderful track and trace application.
Thank you, Sprague. So sticking with serialization, it has been said that it's difficult to print at high speeds to serialized items. What are some of the printing technologies that you can do this? What are their pluses and minuses, and some of the approximate costs?
Yeah. So it you know, everyone says, oh, you got to serialize, but you know, there's a cost to that. You have a box of cereal, it has a barcode on it. It's the same barcode on every box of cereal. If you want to serialize that box of cereal, you need to put an additional piece of data So in the GS1 system, that barcode is called a G10 or a global trade item number. It's SKU in supermarket speak. But then you need in a second piece of data that is unique for that cereal box. Now, it's not really necessary or cost effective to serialize a cereal box. However, as we mentioned, all of us have mentioned on the call here, fresh food is very, very important. So there's, if you have a small number of things, the most expensive, but the easiest to implement is to literally print a label. And typical labels used in the supermarket and food area are called direct thermal labels. So those are the labels that you see, when you get a, meat packaged in the supermarket, they print a label, stick it on. That's a direct thermal label. That is the most expensive way to do it, but still cost effective considering the massive amount of expense incurred with some type of a recall. Next down the line is especially useful and it's used widely in the pharmaceutical area. It's where you put down two ink layers, typically a white layer and a black layer, and then you mark that very quickly with a high-powered laser. In literally milliseconds, you can write the barcode, and it burns off the black layer and has the white layer come through. And there are also are some that do that in reverse, but it's the basic idea of burning off the layer and making a very readable barcode at high speeds, and that's a little less expensive. And the least expensive one that is gaining traction widely is inkjet. And inkjet just has sprays, little drops. Many of us have a inkjet printer at home. It's very cost effective, and especially on the industrial scale. So when you look at a water bottle or something, you'll see best by date, and you'll see this kind of dotted looking kind of numbers on there. So it's difficult to print some barcodes with that technology, and but the improvement is in the technology is happening very rapidly, and that is the least expensive way to add serialization. So barcodes that are kind of dot based have a little bit of an advantage there, but basically any 2D symbology can be printed with inkjet very cost effectively, less expensive than the laser method, and everything is less expensive than the thermal, but thermal is just so easy. So there's a cost trade-off with a convenience trade-off. But those are kind of the big three that we're seeing out there in the serialization world.
Great, thank you, Sprague. Susan, what is the interaction between standards, traceability, and transparency?
Great question. So thanks, Michael. So standards are extremely important. They allow for interoperability, which in turn allows data to be shared amongst trading partners and consumers in a very seamless fashion. Standards give things a digital voice that offers transparency and traceability along the supply chain. And transparency and traceability, they're two different terms, but they're often intermixed and used in the same sentence, but they are very different. Transparency is the ability to provide rich product information to the consumer, with examples today such as the QR code that's printed on packaging labels. Companies have reported seeing a 20% increase in sales and a 14% increase in demand for those products that are able to provide this type of information to the consumer. It requires companies to know what is happening upstream in the supply chain, and then to communicate this knowledge both internally and externally. Transparency also has the ability to take this knowledge, determine what information and how to communicate that information to its customer base, its partner base, and the stakeholders. Stop and take a look around you the next time you're in a grocery store. You'll probably notice a lot of shoppers inspecting product labels, looking at things like allergens, ingredients, claims, countries of origin, what have you. They might even be looking to see how a product was farmed or manufactured. That's because now more than ever, consumers demand transparency, especially with food. They want to know where it's coming from, the ingredients involved in its production, and whether it was grown, raised, or produced using the most ethical practices possible. Today, on average, your dinner has traveled 1,500 miles to make it to your plate. Think of it, 1,500 miles across the US. Consumers want to feel secure knowing their fruits, their veggies, and their packaged food products pose zero risk to themselves or their family. So let's look at the other side and look at traceability. This is the ability to follow the movement of a food product and its ingredients through all the steps in the supply chain, both forwards and backwards. Traceability involves documenting and linking the production, the processing, the transforming, and the distribution of food products and ingredients. Traceability is a tool that's used to assist in the assurance of food safety and the quality, as well as helping to achieve consumer confidence. Traceability is needed to identify the sources of food contamination and the recipients of contaminated food in product recalls. To re-emphasize what Don shared, today we experience on average 2 recalls a day in the United States. Root cause analysis often takes up to 7 days or more. The impact of this is twofold. We throw away food that's not affected by the recall, but we do it to be safe. And on the other side of the coin, the number of foodborne illnesses increases because we don't react fast enough. To get an idea, recalls in the past couple of days have included salmon, red onions, yellow onions, white onions, and dried apricots. And that's only in the last couple of days. Specifically here in the States, the FDA, as Don mentioned, has released the Blueprint for a Smarter Food Supply Chain, which addresses both traceability and transparency, and many other global regulatory agencies around the world have done the same. Technologies enable brands to adhere and maintain standards while providing both transparency and traceability. Technology and innovation will enable quicker response timing to foodborne outbreaks, provide smarter tools for prevention, adapt to new business models that retail has embraced, and build a culture focused on food safety. Standards will help drive efficiency, safety, visibility across both physical and digital channels in a wide variety of sectors.
All right, thank you, Susan. So if there are any questions from our audience, you can send those via the Q&A chat option. I did get some in the chat that I'm going to go over right now. First one's kind of a long one, so bear with me. Deploying the right technology to track products effectively is a key component to traceability. But how do we educate the consumer to have confidence that we can safely track and remove only the affected packages versus being unwilling to buy any during a recall?
I'll jump into that one.
Okay.
When this is where the consumer engagement part really becomes important. When you have, so I'll use the little basket of strawberries example. The consumer, so you have a label. It's the regular label that they're all used to, but kind of hidden in that label is a serialized barcode. So the consumer would be able to scan the barcode, with their phone, and they don't know it's a barcode. It's like like some of the toy catalogs, or you can aim the camera at a picture, and it starts to dance, and sends an order, pops up an order. If the consumer scans the item and it doesn't just say these strawberries, were packed in, on November 7th. It says these strawberries were packed on November 7th in the afternoon at a farm, XYZ farm in the south of California. And the species of strawberry that is grown for this particular pack is this. And so if a consumer starts to experience this rich data linked directly to what they are purchasing, they'll start to kind of get the idea. I remember, I guess I'm old, when barcode kind of first started, people didn't really know what it was supposed to do. But after they got used to the fact that this thing scanned at the point of sale, it pulled up a price, they didn't need the price stuck on the package anymore. They got used to the technology. And at that point, the identity of that cereal box. And the same thing I think is going to happen now, especially the younger people. Man, you can't separate their phone from their existence. And if they start to be able to look at an item with their phone and get that type of minutia of detail, and then they hear a week later that those strawberries are on recall, they'll be like, well, no sweat. Let me just see if it's my strawberries, And I think it's the acceptance of technology will definitely grow as serialization spreads out, and it's the consumer engagement part that's a great question that will solve that type of a trust in the technology kind of a thing.
Oh, Don, you're on mute.
Don't know how that happened. So thank you. I'll just throw this in just ever so quickly. It's really to understand why we have recalls. Okay, so if you have a 1,000 head of cattle or 10 trailer loads of strawberries coming in the back door, that's how much has to leave out the front door to get in the distribution channel. So what they do is they do a COA, certificate of analysis. At some point, it may not come back in time when that product enters into the supply chain. And so from that, the ability to have technology to be able to scan and talk a little bit about what Susan talked about is narrowing your focus to these particular cases that you're really looking at, or this stream, instead of doing these massive recalls. Think about a day in which, if you understand that your product hasn't actually entered the commerce of people yet, you may not even have to do a recall, a massive recall where you're putting that out there. You can scan and you could be able to get, like Sprague talked about, it just pops up and says, send me back, contact the manufacturer, the food processor. We don't need to go any further in here. So that, when you have less of these, I will advocate to you, how many people out there in the audience have actually, you heard about a recall and you went to your freezer and you pulled up out of the freezer your whatever you had, or your refrigerator, and looked at the lot code number on the bottom of there and read the 27 numbers that are there and match them up and said, oh, this is on the recall list. We typically don't do that. We'll cook it out and we'll move forward with it. So I think that, looking at the other end too helps restore consumer confidence in it, because as Susan said, there are a couple of these coming out every day, and it's just like white noise after a while. You just keep moving forward.
Yeah, and not only are you told, take it back, but here's a coupon we're sending to your phone for, 3 free, baskets, next week or whatever.
Great, thank you guys. Susan, I'm just going to direct this next question to you since it's about digitization. You talked earlier about the benefits of digitization. How does one get started digitizing?
So reach out to any of the standards bodies, ISO, AIM, ourselves, GS1, and we can help. We all have disciplines within various verticals, whether they be airline, food, manufacturing, healthcare, logistics, retail, etc. You get the picture. And we're more than able to help guide you through the process of standardization within the industry that applies to your needs. if you reach out to AIM specifically, or you have a global presence, we have a strong focus on our stakeholders and users of barcoding, RFID, smart devices, and all of the automatic identification and data capture technologies that are available. We represent all industries and organizations within the various verticals that we are talking about at this very event today, that use, implement, resell, or develop technology and are essential to enabling this adoption, this growth, and this interoperability that we're talking about. And that's key for everyone who depends on accurate, available, and identifiable data. Right now, we pay a lot of people a lot of money to count things wrong. So thinking of getting to standards and being able to enable them and really change that phenomenon into giving ourselves accurate and speedy delivery of data that's interoperable across all supply chains.
Great stuff, Susan. So it's been a big news story about all the supply chain issues, especially with Christmas and the holidays coming up. This question is there anything that can be done about today's supply chain issues, and when do you think these will be resolved?
All right, I'll jump in on that one. So it's like a crystal ball. You really have to go back to the pain points of all these businesses and why they're doing it. So why digitize? It would be probably a good one too. Why do that? Labor is getting harder and harder, and digitization and use of technology can get you less skill set people come in and work for you today. I mean, I see help wanted signs everywhere. Every warehouse, every restaurant is looking for that. The food distributors that actually break down pallets and actually put like 3 cases of this, 5 cases of that, and go to the restaurant or to the grocery store. 15% of the pallets they push out are wrong. Okay. And so what they're getting is wrong food, and that costs money. I've got estimates from different distributors that costs them $250 to $650 per case. So you have to really look at the expense of really where they're, what the problems are. Food, in its case, if we talk about general supply chain, an iPad can sit in the supply chain for 3 months or 2 months and be okay. We'll go back to Sprague's example. Not a fresh strawberry. You got to move that thing very, very quickly. And going back to what Susan talked about was inventory is very, very important. Near 50% of food distributors do not count their product. It just moves too quick, and they just do an inventory reconciliation with paperwork. When in actuality, it can be 1.6% of their business that's actually leaking from there. So when you have to look at these things, so digitization and where it's happening at and why you're doing it is probably one of the most important questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more there too as well. So like Dom said, it's a crystal ball. So, and it's only becoming increasingly more challenging with current labor constraints as well. I think the last estimate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 plus truck drivers in the US alone, shortages. So it's also dangerous in the case of recalls. It's extremely wasteful. According to Forbes, right now, 97% of the executives say that the pandemic has actually sped up their digital transformation efforts, and 79% say that COVID-19 has increased budgets for some sort of digital transformation. And there's really 3 key driving elements for these investments. We got to capture the information. It has to shift from these siloed, antiquated systems relying on humans as the hub to something more automated and connected, a la digitized, which is what we've been talking about. The second is accuracy. 75 to 80 or even 50%, as Don just mentioned, is not good enough. It's not good enough for inventory, not for supply chain optimization, and never not even close enough for traceability. So as an industry that has sought perfection or nothing, we will start to see incremental improvements toward higher accuracy rates as a key initiative to unlock immediate margin from reducing working capital associated with overstocks and waste. And third, speed. So move faster and automate decisioning to keep up with consumer demands and drive efficiencies in connecting production with consumption. Our demands changed immediately. We went from going out and spending money on theaters and restaurants and activities outside the home to now doing home improvements overnight. So it changed and we could not react. In the end, every player in the supply chain is looking for more information that can be trusted for accuracy and shared more frequently to ensure safety and swift decisioning.
And I'm going to jump in just quickly on that. Basically, every enterprise out there has utilized some form of automation by now. There's really not that much paper and pencil stuff going on. But if there is paper and pencil stuff going on, that company knows, they know where they can improve. And in every implementation that I've seen, from small to big, they're all kind of working on making it a little bit better. So I see incremental improvements happening in the technology, and the pandemic has really accelerated that. We're getting a lot more interest in all of the various layers that we deal with, in terms of just basic item identification, with say some batch and expiry, and all the way up to the gold standard of serialization. So it depends on the enterprise and where they are, but I don't think there's a single company out there that isn't looking very carefully at what they can do next to get the biggest bang for their buck in improving their visibility in the supply chain.
Thank you, Sprague. And I do believe we have time for one more question, so I'll go and do that question. If anyone else has any other questions, you can email me at mike@aimglobal.org. I will forward these questions over to our expert panelists. So the last question is, earlier it was said that the details of the food origin should travel with the product. Do you mean that literally, a high density barcode on each item regardless of pack size describing properties, or can it be a blockchain approach with just a license plate and details in the cloud?
Yeah, I can start that one, and then I'll be very brief, Sprague, and then you can do it. So yeah, FDA is really setting up the 204, where the key data elements and the critical tracking events, along with who the food safety person is and all those type of information, needs to travel along the supply chain. The best way to get that is either cloud environment or to feed up to it. I don't know if you're going to get everything on a barcode per se, but you're going to have to be able to marry that information. That's why we were all talking about digitization here. What's the twin? And then how does that travel? And so you can look at the twin in the cloud or on a blockchain and to be able to do it. Today, the problem is that we're hand entering everything in. We need to automate that. I think Sue talked a lot about that. Susan talked a lot about that. Things have to be automated. We cannot go to hand entries anymore. Sprague, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I just want to answer straight out. In my opinion, you don't need to have lots of secondary data in the barcode itself. You need to identify that item, and that item uniquely. If you serialize it, you're done. It's nice to have other local information, like maybe expiry date, so you don't have to go to the cloud for that. But nutritional information and consumer engagement information and where it was packaged, and whatever else the producer wants to put in there, that should be in a associated database. We all talk about the cloud or whatever, but there's other ways than the cloud to have that data be accessible to members of the supply chain and ultimately to the consumer. And blockchain, that's another great technology for really locking down information that travels as part of the digital identity. But for most situations in fresh food, it's really not necessary. It is like what you can do with the information once you have it in the cloud, but you don't need anything in the barcode. The barcode needs to have a GTIN and a serial number. There it is. And everything else can be related to that digital identity.
All right, great. Thank you, Sprague. And thank you to our panelists for their active participation today. A lot of great information, guys. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for their active participation. Look forward to talking with everyone again soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.